Welcome to Cash Stories, the best channel on all of YouTube. Today, we have a very important and timely topic, Russia versus Europe, the entire history of their rivalry. So get comfortable, grab a good cup of coffee, and get ready to dive into centuries of struggles, alliances, betrayals, and of course, a little bit of humor. Ready? Let's begin. The story of the rivalry between Russia and Europe starts in the 16th century. Europe is dominated by a bunch of monarchies, kingdoms, and of course the power of the Catholic Church, which is very clear about who's in charge. On the other side, a young and ambitious Tsar, Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, decides that being just another king isn't enough for him. Instead, he wants to become an emperor, and for that, he needs to expand Russian territory. This is when in the 16th century the first battles between Russia and Europe begin. Ivan the Terrible faces off against the mighty Poland-Lithuania, and although he doesn't always win, he never gives up. Here Europe starts to notice that there's a giant in the east, one that's ready to fight, and fight it does. Let's jump ahead a century. In 1682, Peter the Great, the new Tsar, decides it's time for Russia to become an empire just like those of Europe. And if there's one thing Russians hate more than the cold, it's not being taken seriously. So, after a few battles and many reforms, Peter creates the Russian Empire. But of course Europe wasn't exactly thrilled to let Russia be the new star of the show. Europe, and especially the Ottoman Empire, were scared of Russia's growing influence. And rightly so. In just a couple of generations, the Russians started claiming territories in the north and south, clashing directly with European interests. This is when the famous Northern Wars happen, and Peter the Great faces off with Sweden, one of Europe's most powerful empires at the time. In the end, Peter, with a newly reformed army, crushes Sweden and earns the respect of all of Europe. That's when Europeans realize Russia is no joke. But of course, like in any good international conflict, after a couple of battles the Russians and Europeans shake hands, become friends, and begin a kind of convenience pact. Though, as we know, friendships between empires tend to be complicated. Let's skip to the 19th century. What a fun century it was. Here, the rivalry between Russia and Europe reaches new heights. At the center of it all is Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who wanted to reshape the entire map of Europe to his liking. Russia, under the leadership of Alexander I, had a big problem. Napoleon was conquering everything in his path across Europe. So, what does Russia do, what any empire would do? At first, they try to make a deal with Napoleon, but when they realize this guy has an ego bigger than his army, they decide they can't just sit back. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 is one of the most epic and tragic chapters in history. The Russians retreat to Moscow, and suddenly, a bitter Siberian winter does Russia a huge favor. Napoleon not only loses thousands of soldiers, but he also watches his dream of a unified French Empire crumble. From here on out, the rest of Europe starts to see Russia in a new light. Instead of just a threat, Russia might now be part of the solution. But of course, like any good historical drama, things don't stay peaceful for long. The friendship between Russia and Europe deteriorates as each side's interests diverge. Whether it's due to British imperial influence or internal struggles within Russia, tensions remain constant throughout the 19th century. The rivalry between Russia and Europe takes a radical turn with the outbreak of World War I. At this point, Russia and Europe are on opposite sides, with the Russian Empire fighting against the Central Powers. But as usual, war isn't the only thing happening. In 1917, amidst the chaos of war, Russia faces its own revolution. The Russian Revolution ends the Tsarist regime, and instead of being an imperial power, Russia becomes the Soviet Union, a communist state that has problems not just with Europe, but with the entire capitalist world. Europe, of course, doesn't look too kindly on the new USSR. The fear of communism, the lack of trust in the Soviets, and the political climate in Europe only deepens the rivalry. This leads us to one of the most complex chapters in history, marking a crucial turning point in relations between Russia and Europe, World War II. At the start of the war in 1939, the Soviet Union, led by Stalin, and the rest of Europe weren't exactly friends. In fact, the USSR had signed a pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that surprised many since they were aligning with a common enemy in Europe. Through this pact, Hitler and Stalin gave each other a breather, but true alliances wouldn't last long. However, in 1941, history takes an unexpected turn. Hitler, being the megalomaniac he was, couldn't resist looking east and decides to invade the USSR, starting the famous Operation Barbarossa. This is when alliances really get redefined. Suddenly, the USSR, which was fighting Nazi Germany, is forced to join the Allied forces, England, France, and the United States. The shift was drastic, but the threat of Hitler over Europe was so great that everyone's interests aligned against the same enemy. So overnight, the USSR became one of the main allies of the Western powers. Of course, the ideological differences between the USSR and capitalist democracies didn't vanish, but the goal was clear: defeat the Third Reich. Together, the Allies, with the USSR fighting on the Eastern Front while the British and Americans handled the Western Front, began to push back German forces, eventually defeating them in 1945. And then came the Cold War, the golden age of rivalry between Russia, now the USSR, and Europe, primarily represented by NATO, led by the United States. This period was one of opposing blocs, espionage, space races, and of course, indirect confrontations through third-party countries. Every time someone in Europe or the world made a move, Russia and Europe eyed each other like two caged tigers, waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. Today, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, relations between Russia and Europe are still a chess game, but with new pieces. NATO, the European Union, gas? Tensions are still present, but so are opportunities for cooperation. Fast forward to the present. In 2022, something many thought was forgotten happens again. Russia invades Ukraine. After years of tensions, broken diplomacy, and NATO's eastward expansion, Vladimir Putin decides it's time to return to war. The invasion of Ukraine not only marks a return to old historical rivalries, but it puts the entire world on edge. Europe, which had been relatively calm in terms of major territorial conflicts, now sees Russia challenging the international order, endangering not only Ukraine's security, but the stability of all of Europe. And of course, Europe can't just stand by. Once again, we're facing an indirect confrontation with sanctions, military support to Ukraine, and a global economy shaking from the consequences. What's the future? Nobody knows, but one thing's for sure: the rivalry between Russia and Europe hasn't died. There may not be open wars like before, but geopolitical tensions are alive and kicking, and this time, resources and economic influence are playing a much bigger role than before. And that's our quick tour through the history of this rivalry. If you liked it, give it a like, subscribe, and share it with that friend who thinks history is boring. Leave me a comment if you want me to make more videos like this, or on another topic. See you in the next Cash Stories video. Until next time.